Africa, we have a country or a continent in which electricity is not widely available. It's certainly, for the most part, with a few countries as exceptions, a developing economy. And we see very clearly this linkage between the availability of reliable, economical electricity and a gross domestic product. Those countries that have sparse access to electricity, that are still developing their grids and where not all of the population is well served by electricity, tend to be below average in GDP. This is a very strong linkage historically and continues to be, although in the developing countries, even though gross domestic product may be growing, for a century, that tracked exactly with the growth in consumption of electricity. More recently, in the developed countries, we have seen a divergence, and where we have very little growth in the developed countries in the consumption of electricity, still considerable growth in gross domestic product, and that's a measure of the increasing efficiency of production of goods and services in these developed countries, but also the fact that many of the more energy intensive smelting, those kinds of industries have moved out of the developing countries where labor is expensive and the overhead costs of doing business are expensive and taxes may be expensive, to developing countries where labor is less expensive, there's less of a tax burden, and the costs of production are lower. And here is a link that you can view at your leisure to see that in more detail. So looking at an alternative view of the world, remember those other things that we saw show geographically the size of the countries, show in color the population density. If we were to say that the land area of a country is defined by its gross domestic product, here are the largest countries in the world. Now, this is a fairly interesting graphic, and you see that the largest countries in the world, if we say that the space they take up in the world is proportional to their gross domestic product, not their geographic land area or their population, etc. It's the developed countries. It's North America, Western Europe, Japan and South Korea, Australia, a couple of the other island nations. That is who makes all the money, who has the largest gross domestic product, and also use the most electricity by far compared to the rest of the world. Again, here is a place to go to get additional detail on that slide. Looking at the distribution of the world's gross domestic product, a different way of looking at this, the richest 20% of the countries, the richest 20% of the income has 82.7% of all of the GDP in the world. And once again, at the top of that funnel are the developed countries, and specifically North America, Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, and some island nations. And then the rest of the world has less than 20% of the production and sale of goods and services domestically and worldwide. Again, the reference for you to go and see this. Just as an aside, a fun thing to kind of get a personal view of this is to go to this website called Global Rich List and enter your annual income. Now, this is not based on assets. There's a different way of looking at this if you look at total assets. But if you just look at annual income, what you report on your income taxes, and you enter this here, It tells you where you are percentage-wise in your income among all the people in the world. And look at this. If you make $47,500 a year, you're in the top 1% of the richest people in the world. And that's completely consistent with that funnel diagram. In fact, let's just go back up and reinforce this. And with this diagram, all the riches are in these developed countries. Almost all of the electricity usage in the world, well over half of the electricity usage in the world, is in these developed countries. And if you make $47,500 a year, you obviously are in one of those developed countries in all likelihood. Go a little bit farther. At $225,000 a year, I think this probably maybe 1/10 of what Johan makes. I'm not exactly sure, and I'm joking, of course. A feeble attempt at humor. If you make $225,000 a year, you're in the top 1/1000th% of the people in the world. Now, the whole point of all of this so far is to lay out the disproportionate distribution of population and population density on the one hand versus riches, consumption of electricity on the other hand. So let's go a little farther and talk about electricity. Here's electricity consumption per country in megawatt hours per year. Now this is total, this is not per capita. We'll look at per capita in a minute. So look at the countries in red that use the most electricity gross, total megawatt hours. So the United States, and who is that over there? It looks a little bit like China, doesn't it? Have the largest electricity consumption in the world. On the one hand, you've got the United States, which is by some measures the most developed economy in the world and uses more electricity per capita than anybody in the world by far. On the other hand, you have China, which has most of the population and population density, but you'll see pretty quickly less of the electricity, and they used, so it's population density in China and its productivity in North America, and most specifically the United States, that drive electricity. So either you have a lot of people and you use a lot of electricity, or you have a lot of riches, a lot of productivity, and you use a lot of electricity. And then coming in second, you have Russia, India, coming in third, Australia, Brazil, and you see the distribution there. So here's the resource for you to chase. Now, if we look at it per capita, you get a slightly different picture. Here is the consumption per capita. So red means, and this is in kilograms of oil equivalent. We'll look at this in terms of kilowatt hour here in just a minute. But look at who uses the most electricity per person. So now China disappears. Remember, they use so much electricity just because their population is so huge and they're such a huge country. But now the countries that use the most electricity per person are North America, the Scandinavian countries, Luxembourg, and a couple of other small pieces of Europe, Australia, and Saudi Arabia. So that's a fairly interesting, different kind of distribution. And remember, our first objective here in this presentation is to begin to get a picture in our minds, because sometimes I found I had the good fortune of consulting for the World Bank as a contractor for a number of years and got to travel widely in the developing countries and learned a lot, which most people in the developing countries don't know about how population and wealth and electricity consumption and things split out. And we're going to try to draw some conclusions in a minute about why this is important in our domestic electric utility business. So now look at this. This gets even more interesting. Here is the electricity consumption per capita in kilowatt hours in each of those years. Okay, so here's kilowatt hour per person in each of these years, look who wins going away in terms of kilowatt hours consumed per capita. The United States. Russia is next. Look where China is. And look where India is. Remember, they were one of the large consumers of electricity, but per person, given their consumer density and the amount of electricity they use, when you divide the latter by the former, they don't use very much electricity per capita. Even China, we use 14,000 kilowatt hours per person per year in the United States, and China is basically an order of magnitude less than that. So we're going to go a little farther and begin to try now to draw some conclusions about this. This slide is completely hopeless in terms of you being able to see it. It needs to be up on a big screen. I include it here only for you to go and look at it, to look at this site and understand this graph a little bit better. But once again, it presents the same thing. You see these circles, which are measures of world energy capacity, that is the ability to produce BTUs and kilowatt hours, and their consumption. And again, you see the same thing that we saw before. It's either the huge populations or the hugely developed countries that have all of the capacity and the consumption. Okay, so we made a tie between population density, developed versus developing, and consumption of electricity. When we look at it worldwide, the developed countries account for 60% of all the electricity consumed in the world, even though they account for only 20% of the population in the world. 20% of the world's population consumes 80% or 60% of the world's energy. Okay? Now let's think about that for a minute. Remember the other tie? The tie on productivity, which is also a tie to personal wealth. It's a tie to quality of living. It's a tie to productivity of business. So if I live in a developing country, what do I want to do? If I'm in business development in the government, if I'm an individual living there, if I'm a worker, I want to use more energy, because the availability of electricity, economical, reasonably reliable, and sustainable, defines quality of life if you measure it by GDP. And GDP is only one measure, certainly, but it is a measure of affluence. It's a measure of quality of life and productivity of business. So the 80% of the world that's only using 40% of the energy wants to use a lot more energy. And there's a lot of them. What kind of energy are they going to use? Well, until now, they have typically done the same thing we have done in the developed countries: coal, oil, gas, hydro. Now, in the developing countries, we've pretty much developed all the hydro that there is to develop. So that becomes a smaller slice of our pie as time goes on. Russia, China, Africa still have some hydro to develop, so it will be a growing part of their pie. But the slice I want you to look at there is look at wind and other renewables in terms of the capacity forecasts in the world. As the rest of the world proceeds to try to use more electricity, and if we go back up to this picture, if you'll allow me, look, all of them want to use more electricity. All of them are growing in their electricity usage. We're the only ones, actually, that are really in decline. We've gone from an exponential growth in the consumption of electricity to now our S-curve has bent over. And in the last 3 years, we've actually used less electricity total in the United States than we did in the previous 100 years. In other words, it's a downwards turn. So the rest of the world is going to develop and use electricity differently than we did in our country. Now, if you look in India and China and Africa, they do not have an electric grid built out like we do. Now, India probably has the most well-developed electric grid. Russia comes fairly close in those areas where there's a substantial population, but they don't have a grid like we do. And guess how renewable energy works? In the traditional production of electricity, great big giant power plants were the order of the day because that's what made them economical. If I made a power plant really large, the price per kilowatt hour is lower. That's called an economy of scale. So I could build a 5 megawatt coal plant or a 500 megawatt coal plant or a 5,000 megawatt coal plant, and the bigger I built it, the cheaper it was per kilowatt hour. And that's why we ended up in the developing countries with nuclear plants that are 2,000 and 3,000 megawatts in capacity, coal plants that are 5,000 and 10,000 megawatts in capacity. But wind and solar PV is modular. There is no possible way to build a 2,500 megawatt wind turbine. You're going to build smaller wind turbines and space them around. Now, when you realize that in the world there are more than 1.2 billion people who have no access to electricity at all, just think, either they can wait for a grid to be built out like we spent 100 years doing in the developing countries, or they can get a solar cell and a battery and an appliance at their house. They can get a wind turbine and a battery and an appliance at their home or business. And so not only are we going to see the rest of the world begin to use their share of electricity, they're going to do it not as much with coal and oil and gas and nuclear as we did in the developed countries for a whole variety of reasons. That's another webinar altogether. Safety reasons, economics reasons, security reasons, sustainability reasons. The recent Paris Accords on climate change causes everyone in the world, and everyone in the world agreed to it, that maybe we ought not to be rejecting as much carbon into the atmosphere, both in power plants as well as in cars or transportation, as well as in oil and gas wells that consistently leak into the atmosphere. So now look at who leads in the world in the deployment of renewable energy. Look who's at the top: China, Brazil. You're beginning to see Mexico in the top, India. And India has been very slow to adopt renewable energy. Part of what they have is such a huge population that helps them be in the lead, even though per capita they have a fairly low renewable energy total. So these developing countries are probably not going to build out the kind of grid that we built out. They're probably not going to build the kind of power plants that we built, but they're going to build a lot of whatever it is they do because they want to use, in the limit, as much electricity as we use in the developing countries, because that, in many ways, defines our quality of life and productivity of business. What it means to live in a developed country, more than any other thing, is the presence of infrastructure. Now, part of that is paved roads and potable water and wastewater systems, but the crowning achievement is the availability of reliable, economical, secure, safe electricity, and the rest of the world is going to get their share because that's how they improve their quality of life and productivity of business. Here's a different way of looking at renewable energy production, and it's basically expressing each country's renewable energy production as really as a percentage of their total energy production. And now you begin to see some countries that are ahead of the game. For example, in Germany, their renewable energy production as a percentage of their total energy production is very high. In fact, Germany in the gross has more megawatts of installed solar PV than the United States of America does. We have way more population, a way larger gross domestic product, but Germany has more solar PV. Look at Canada. Why does Canada appear here? Because they have so much hydro. They have an immense amount of hydro. Central Africa, Zaire, for example, has an immense amount of hydro. Much of the developed countries are lagging behind in terms of renewables as a percentage of their total, in part because we have an incumbent industry structure that still wants to build traditional power plants and earn a return on those for shareholders. I included this slide. It's a kind of a drastic slide, but I don't know if many of you know this, but only in North America and northern South America and in Saudi Arabia and some island nations, Japan, is the grid frequency 60 hertz. In the rest of the world, it's 50 hertz, which just goes to show you that the rest of the world may not do what all of us have done, what we have done in the developed countries. I remember being involved in a power plant at Itaipu when I was a consultant in a past life, and we were doing the interconnection studies for the hydro plant at Itaipu, half of which belonged to Paraguay and half of which belonged to Brazil because they shared that river as a border. And so half of that generation was 50 hertz and half of it was 60 hertz. What does that have to do with anything? Nothing other than the fact that it's not necessarily the case that all the world is going to do what we did in the developed countries, not even all of the developed countries. One other issue that I want to mention, and then we'll begin to draw this to a close, is oil is a fuel that's on the way out. And we've seen this. We've also seen coal as a fuel that's on the way out. China has closed down 10,000 coal mines in the last year and closing more down. They figured out that you can't breathe in China if you use as much coal as they were using, and now they're the world's leader in the implementation of wind and other renewable energy sources. As oil fades, it changes the whole nature of security and government relations worldwide. Energy is the currency of world relations and security. And we'll begin to see oil importers not import as much oil, not even for transportation as we move towards electric vehicles, and that electricity comes from things other than carbon. Finally, emissions. We mentioned this earlier. Here are the annual emissions as of 2009, and then who's contributed the most emissions cumulatively since the Industrial Revolution until now. Look who wins with the most pollution cumulatively in the world. The richest country in the world that uses the most electricity per capita in the world. If the rest of the world catches up to the United States and to the other developed countries, as dirty as the United States did, none of us in the world will be able to breathe. And so that's not going to happen. We're going to see a different pattern as the rest of the world catches up and uses more electricity. And so a survey was done in 2009 of countries asking people to rank how important they thought climate change should be ranked. Look who ranks the lowest. Americans, we don't care. You know, we want to use our energy. We think climate change is a hoax. A lot of the rest of the world ranked this as much higher than 5, which would be sort of. A very high priority would be 10. Look who ranked that the highest. Mexico and China. In every way, developing countries who are going to, absolutely use more electricity than they use now. Now, what are the implications for the rest of us, for those of us in North America, for example, the rest of the world is going to have an exploding demand for fuels, raw materials, impact on the environment, capital, skilled labor, and technology. We are going to face greater competition for all of these things as the rest of the world catches up. We're going to see the costs of the conventional solutions, the life cycle cost of coal plants, nuclear plants, oil plants, escalate. Even gas, the hardware life cycle cost of gas plants is escalating. The only thing that saves us right now is that the price of gas has fallen to $2 a million BTU, but that price is very volatile, and if you factor in the risk value of that volatility and availability, gas is not as great as we think, plus it's still carbon. It's cleaner carbon, but it's still carbon. At the same time, as Michael Liebrich from Bloomberg Energy Finance points out over and over in what he calls the inexorable march of the price signal, the per kilowatt hour cost, life cycle cost of solar PV, wind, batteries, fuel cells, all of the renewable sources marches consistently downwards. So what we used to depend on is getting more and more expensive, especially if we factor in environmental and sustainability costs, whereas the costs of alternative solutions, solar, wind, and storage, are declining. Now, we have already built out most of our grid, and it's hard for us to add that stuff. But if you're in a country that doesn't have very much electricity consumption and wants more, they don't have barriers to building out this kind of decentralized renewable energy like we do. Uh-oh, I don't know what happened there. Let's see if we can get that back. The other thing that happens is if we are a country that is an incumbent and we're an electric utility in one of those countries, we're going to face increasing volatility and risk. But the cost of wind and solar goes down and the cost of our native production goes up, we're going to lose sales. We're going to lose customers, and we're going to have higher risk. And finally, there's going to be a decreasing gap between the developed and developing countries in terms of energy consumption, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and in fact, many developing countries lead us in renewable energy already. This leads to what I think may be the most important factor of this entire presentation. The rest of the world, the developing countries, did not build out copper telephone systems like the United States did, like Europe did, like Canada did. They jumped immediately to wireless. They leapfrogged us. There was no sense building out copper and investing all of that money and spending all of that time when it was cheaper and better to go mobile. I was in Mumbai a while back, and I was with Prasad Paturi from the Indian utility, and we saw a truck going by, piled up in the back with tablets and computers and cell phones, etc. And I asked Prasad, is that going to the dump? What is that? He said, no, they're driving that into town to charge those up and upgrade the operating systems, and then he's going to take those back out in the country and give them back to their owners. So here was a country that in parts of the country did not have readily available electricity, but by golly, they had cell phones. And we're going to see a lot of the innovation in a smart grid and in energy production and energy utilization. A lot of those innovations are going to happen in these developing countries that don't already have an incumbent grid and an incumbent industry. So what should you be doing? And with this, I'll close and we'll take some questions. First of all, if you're in the United States of America, I think Canadians are probably a little better than this than we are, but by and large in North America, we're not very familiar with the rest of the world. We're somewhat chauvinistic, somewhat myopic, and I think it stands us in good stead to understand more about the rest of the world, the population, the industry, the electricity consumption, the sources of their energy. There are many sources. One of my favorites that I get every time a new edition comes out is the Penguin State of the World Atlas. I would recommend it highly to you. The other thing we've got to do in the developed countries, and specifically North America, is become a lot more innovative and quit just trying to do the same thing we've been doing for 100 years. We've got to have a vision for a new energy future, which means new strategies and methods and adopting new technologies. Texas, I think we've done very well. We have probably more wind energy than any other state, both per capita and in gross, and we've done well there. We still haven't joined the United States of America electrically. We're still an independent republic, and so I think we will join. I think we'll see DC technologies become more important in the grid at large and at customer sites in specific. And finally, we have to begin to think about risk management, about how do we manage against the risk of declining sales, increasing costs, and loss of market share to not just Solar City in our country, but to the rest of the world. One of the ways that we do that is with what we call the smart grid, and we'll talk about that sometime in another webinar. Thanks for listening. Here is my contact information. I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn. I tweet as the Smart Grid Man. And thank you so very much for participating in our webinar today. Johan, I'll give the control back to you.
Thank you, Steve. Greatly appreciate you sharing some knowledge and getting us to understand the big picture. I am curious if we have any questions. If you do have questions, you can go in and write those questions in the this little bar that we have as an attendee in this. But I'm curious now. I have one question for you, Steve. Here, if you were an entrepreneur, maybe here in North America, and you would like to take advantage of this knowledge related to the global picture and what you have shared with us, where do you think that there are opportunities? Where do you think they are, and what kind of opportunity would make sense as a businessman, as an entrepreneur, etc.?
I think there are several areas that I would concentrate on, and they're important both in the developed countries and in the developing countries. And there are three key categories. The first one is energy storage. There's an interesting website, and I'm sorry that I don't have the URL for you, but if you Google it, you can find it. You Google for the land area in Saudi Arabia that at today's conversion efficiencies with solar cells would produce as many kilowatt hours in a year as the world uses in a year. And you would think, well, that would be most of Saudi Arabia. No, it's a relatively small chunk of Saudi Arabia. Now, they're very rich in solar radiation. And so Saudi Arabia, Morocco, you know, those African countries and the Middle East have a huge solar resource. But how do I get that electricity someplace else? Is there any way to convert it into something that can be transported? Is there any way even in that country to store it for the times when the sun isn't shining that I want to use electricity? So energy storage and transportation, I think, is a key element. A second key element is what we call information and communications technology. There is something going on that Bob Metcalfe talks about a good bit. He's the inventor of the Ethernet, professor at the University of Texas, the originator of Metcalfe's law. And he says that we spent the last few decades creating clean, reliable, dependable information with the Internet. And we're going to spend the next few decades doing the same thing, clean, reliable, sustainable energy with what he calls the Internet, which is a convergence of the electric utility business, the grid business, with the Internet of Things. So that as time moves on, we go, in this country today, we have about 20,000 generating units, but we have 1.5 million rooftop solar arrays. How in the world do you keep track of that? That requires broadband two-way digital communications. That is the heart of the smart grid, is that two-way digital communications, remote monitoring and analysis, autonomous automation, a thing called swarm intelligence, where you've got millions of these, you can't dispatch them centrally, so you come up with ways of promoting efficiency and reliability through swarm intelligence. The third area, I think, of real innovation is in the area of utilization of electricity. Consumers now think in terms of not just cheap electricity, but a smart home, or a smart building, or a smart appliances, or a smart city, or smart transportation, or smart medical care. And that's part of the transformation of energy from a commodity on the electric side to a means of enabling quality of life and productivity of business in a fashion that I, as a consumer, can understand and control, like a Nest thermostat, or an iPhone app that lets me make sure all the water is turned off in my house. So those are three areas that immediately come to mind, in addition to the ones that are obvious, like improving transmission and distribution, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. Excellent, Steve. Now, do we have any, I don't know if you can see the questions, Steve, if we have anybody that is participating in this webinar with us that maybe have some questions beyond what we have talked about. I'll give everybody here a minute to maybe. You saw one coming up?
Yeah, I see one coming up. What do you think about? And now it disappeared. Not sure what happened there. Whoever just submitted that question, would you be willing to type it in again? I clicked on it and it went away. And I apologize. It began with, what do you think about? And that was all I could see. And when I clicked on it, it went away.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see it either. We'll give it another few seconds here to see if it'll pop up. And I think you can write it in the chat section here, right?
Right. Yeah, there's a little arrow that says questions, and they can write the question. Here we go. What do you think about microgrid sector in developed countries? Very good question. I think microgrids is an exploding area in the developed countries. It's obviously happening in the developing countries because, take China for example. They have scores of cities with a population of 1 million or more. I don't know if you call a city with 1 million people in it a microgrid, but compared to the United States or Canada, where we connected everybody together in a wide area synchronous grid, I think you're going to see a lot of little grids. India tried very hard. They have 7 major segments of their grid, and they had some problems a couple of years ago with the national blackout issues, and have kind of segregated those. I think microgrids mitigate risk of a wide area outage, which we have more and more of in the developed countries, particularly in North America. We have more outages that happen more often and last longer. And so microgrids give an entity like a data center or someone else the ability to be more reliable than perhaps the grid is. It may also give them the ability to be 100% renewable, as opposed to having to take any carbon-based or nuclear-based energy from the grid. And it may also enable efficiency in an all DC microgrid. If you think about a data center that's using solar PV and batteries, okay, that electricity is being made and stored at DC. Then it's inverted to AC and traverses through the building, through the wiring, and then guess what happens? All of those servers, all of that electronics, it gets re-rectified to DC again, the efficiency losses range in the 10 to 20% efficiency losses, as well as that is a high maintenance, operations and maintenance device. And so you begin to think about, well, a microgrid, which is entirely DC to DC. So I think microgrids is an exploding new sector in both the developed countries and the developing countries.
Excellent. Do you see any more questions there, Steve?
I do. Do you see a U.S. electric co-op showing their interest in smart grids? This, Don, you must be from a co-op. I'll tell you that I was just at Midwest Energy in Michigan last Thursday and Friday. Actually, we were in South Bend, Indiana, right across the border, doing a strategic technology planning session. And I am seeing more and more electric cooperatives who are extending fiber to the premises in to their members and maybe even areas beyond their members, in part to bring internet to rural areas, sort of like we brought electricity to rural areas. I have worked with co-ops all my career, but also as a control plane, a monitoring and control plane for a smarter grid, a way of communicating with those smart sensors and enabling smart healthcare and smart education. So yeah, I think the majority of co-ops tend to be in the wait and see mode, but I do see some real pioneers in smart grid, and specifically putting in solar gardens, community solar projects, wind energy, information and communications technology. I think it is really growing. There was another question here about, Don, you said U.S. co-ops cost to serve per customer begins to look like some of the third world. Can smart grid help this cost? I mean, the issue that we have in rural America is that we have, the average co-op has 7,000 customers per mile of line. The average city has 60 customers per mile of line, and the average IOU has 30 customers per mile of line. So if I have to operate more miles of line, which means more mileage on trucks and less kilowatt hour sales per employee, then my costs per kilowatt hour are higher than other folks. Now, the nice thing about that is that anybody else who comes out there and tries to serve them with wires faces the same barrier. Unfortunately, though, your competition is not another electric utility moving in. It's Solar City, who sees rural retail rates as more attractive than urban retail rates to compete with when trying to sell their solar PV. Can smart grid help with those costs? I think that they can, but I think the other thing that electric co-ops are going to have to do is find other sources of revenue in order to defray some of those costs. And some of those sources of revenue may be renewable energy, maybe smart grid solutions, smart home solutions, etc. And there's my friend Ari Brish. Can you talk a little bit about sharing electricity between countries? Ari, this has two issues. One is, do we connect countries together with transmission? You know, we have some very strong ties with Canada in the Northeast and in the Northwest, primarily because that hydro was so valuable to us in the United States of America. We have very weak ties with Mexico. Of course, they're more of a consuming nation than they are a producing nation. I saw a paper recently by a college professor that suggested that in the long run, the entire world could be tied together with DC transmission so that while it's night in one part of the world, we could be transmitting the solar output from another part of the world. I think that might be a kind of a long shot. I think the other approach might be, is there some way of storing that energy and transporting it? I mean, one of the advantages of coal and even gas and nuclear is that I can transport that fuel to power plants around. It's difficult to transport that electricity very far without huge losses. I think neighboring countries the more neighboring countries that connect together, the more diversity there is. And even in the U.S., if we had tighter connections, as the sun's going down in the west, it's as the sun is bright in the middle part of the country, we do have some solar diversity. We do have some wind diversity. I don't see how transmission solves that in the long run, but it's certainly something worth looking at. The final question that I see here is from Bruce Edwards. How do you see U.S. energy policy impacting local distribution company utilities, driving smart grid expansion, and getting customers willing to pay for the system upgrades? I don't see that we have a very strong U.S. energy policy right now. We went through the smart grid grants program, and its primary objective was jobs, and smart grid just provided an opportunity for doing that. I don't think we have a very strong national energy policy in the U.S. to further this. I think a lot of the progress is being made by innovative utilities, and to some lesser extent local governments. Those 2011 of the electric utilities in the United States of America are municipally owned governments that own and operate their utility. I was just doing an all-employee meeting with City Public Service of San Antonio this morning, and very innovative, moving forward very rapidly, but it is expensive, and those customers who can afford to get off the grid with rooftop solar leave those customers who can't afford to get off the grid with higher bills, and it's a thorny problem. And I don't know what the solution is. It's something we're going to have to work through. Well, Johan,
Okay,
that's all
Steve,
the questions I see.
Yeah, we're coming towards the end of our hour. Are there any more questions there that you see?
I don't see any.
Okay. Well, thank you, Steve, for doing this webinar with us. I hope everybody who's been online have enjoyed it and learned something new, or maybe it has also created some new questions for us, some new interests in some new areas. We also want to thank Sandra Young that works with Paragon Group for arranging this webinar and handling all the logistics. Sandra, I'm not sure if there's anything else that we need to add on here. I know we're going to send the email out, a recording and the slides. Anything that you want to add? Since I'm not hearing from Sandra, I'm assuming that we have everything covered. Thanks again, Steve. This concludes the end of the webinar. Everybody have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. So long.